Have you ever heard these phrases? You can't do that. It's too hard. You're not good enough. Just be realistic. Everyone else is doing it this way. Don't rock the boat. What if you fail? You're too old or you're too young for that. Just stick to what you know. These are phrases people use to try to force people to give up and to quit so that they will not succeed. And have you ever wondered why some people are so eager to see you fail? Why they're the ones telling you things like this that we see here on the PowerPoint. Now, there are a lot of reasons people will say that, but probably the most common one is they just don't want you to show them up with your success. They want to stay comfortable with their mediocrity, and if you do something amazing, they have to deal with the fact that they have not done anything at all. No one wants to feel like they're losing the game of life, so rather than deal with their own fear, insecurities, and laziness, it's just easier and less work to hold you back, to try to get others to stay in mediocrity and failure with them. And since we live in a world filled with flawed people who fail and want you to fail, it's so easy to succumb to their attempts to sabotage you and stymie your efforts to succeed. So we must not give in, especially to anyone who wants to sabotage or tries to sabotage our faithful service to God. And that's where it gets really important. It may not be so important with your financial success or your career success and things like that, though you don't want people trying to stop that. But when it comes to your spiritual success, don't let anybody talk you out of succeeding. And that's why we need to be bold believers like David. In 1 Samuel 17, which is our lesson tonight, is David the bold believer. And if you weren't here last week, we are in the middle, or we've begun a series called David, a Better Man, as we look at David, the life of David, over the next few sermons. Last week we began with his humble origins from 1 Samuel 16, and tonight we're going to look at him as a bold believer in chapter 17. And if you recall, we began with looking at some major declarations about David before we even knew who he was. Look back in chapter 13 and verse 14. In chapter 13 and verse 14, Saul has incurred God's wrath, and so God has him tell Samuel, or Samuel to tell Saul that he's acted foolishly in disobedience and not trusting and obeying God. And then in verse 14 he says this, "But now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as a ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." And so most of us are familiar with the phrase, a man after God's own heart, and this is where it comes from. It's reference to David before David's even named. We don't know how old he would have been at this time, probably a very young boy, and depending on how early this was in Saul's reign. Maybe even just having been born, but he's not identified by name. And then we see him in chapter 15, a few years later, getting closer to the age when we're going to get to meet him, in this terrible event where Saul completely disobeys God, then argues with Samuel and says, "Well, I did obey God." And Samuel says, "No, you didn't." "Yes, I did." "No, you didn't." "Yes, I did." And then so Samuel said this to him in verse 22, and this is a passage we need to memorize. It's probably one that we have memorized if we've been in Bible classes. "Has the Lord as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams." By the way, let me put a pause there. That's not a contradiction. That's not a self-contradiction. Sacrifice, obedience. He's not contrasting sacrifice and obedience. He's contrasting the wrong kind of sacrifice with obedience. Sacrifices had been and were a part of the law. They were a requirement of anyone who was going to serve God. So the problem wasn't with the sacrifice, it was with the attitude behind it and the fact that it was an act of disobedience to sacrifice these animals that Saul said they were going to sacrifice. So it's a matter of serving God from the heart, doing what God says. Verse 23, "For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and insubordination is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. And so then if you recall this event, so Samuel is getting ready to leave, and Saul reaches out and grabs his robe and rips it and tries to snatch him back and basically threatening his life if he didn't do what Saul wanted. And this is where we get the statement about David being the better man in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 28. So Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to your neighbor who is better than you." And so that's where we're getting the title of the series, David, a Better Man. I just want to kind of give that to us, kind of get us set up and understanding that. Now, these were statements made about David before we had any idea who he was. And then because the main reason was that Samuel didn't identify him, is that Saul would have had him killed. In fact, as we know from the last 10 or 12 years of Saul's life, David's having to run from him all the time because Saul's trying to kill him. In fact, if you recall, we pointed out last week, Samuel had to disguise the reason for going to Bethlehem. God in chapter 16 sent him to Bethlehem, and he had to disguise the reason by holding a sacrificial feast. And in the end of that, we saw how David was shown to be the one of of Jesse's sons that Samuel was to pick, because God looked at the heart. You're in chapter 16, look at verse 7, another very important principle. Verse 7, the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature." So he's looking at David's oldest brother. "Because I have rejected him." And notice what he says here. "For God sees not as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance." They look for height, hair, handsome, beautiful, whatever it might be. They look at the externals. He says, but God, or the Lord, looks at the heart. And then in verses 12 and 13, we see that David gets anointed. Verse 12, he says, "So he sent and brought him in." This is David. Now he was ruddy with beautiful eyes and a handsome appearance. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. Now, the word anoint there is the word Messiah. We know Jesus as the Messiah, and it's the word for anointed. And it's the idea of someone who is anointed to a specific position or place. And so your prophets and your priests and your kings would be anointed. They would be messiahs. The idea that David became kind of the focal point that was looking ahead to the coming of the real Messiah, the real King, the real anointed one of God, and that is the Christ that we serve. So we have David there in Bethlehem, and it's interesting that he just kind of stays there, kind of like what Saul did. Remember how Saul, after he was anointed king and after he was brought forth and shown to be king, he goes back, and when he's called to go to war, he's plowing in the field, and he has to actually kind of change gears. Well, David does kind of the same thing here. He's playing his music and guarding the sheep. He stays there in Bethlehem. In fact, in chapter 16, we see where he now is kind of drafted into service for Saul as a musician. And in verses 22 and 23 of chapter 16, we read this. "Saul sent to Jesse, saying, 'Let David now stand before me, for he has found favor in my sight.' So it came about, whenever the evil spirit from God came to Saul, David would take the harp and play it with his hand, and Saul would be refreshed and be well, and the evil spirit would depart from him." And so David would go and he would play music for Saul there, wherever Saul might be at the time, and then he would go home. Chapter 17, verse 15. "But David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's flock at Bethlehem." So he was doing dual service. He was playing music for Saul, but then he would go home and attend the sheep. And so he was staying busy there. Now, while he's there back home tending sheep, we see David as the bold believer in this conflict with Goliath there in chapter 17. And let's set the stage for this conflict with kind of a bird's eye view of the Valley of Elah. Driving up from Bowling Green, it's always nice on coming at 185 and 187, seeing when you come out of between a couple of hills and you see a nice valley unfolding, and then on one side there's a hill on one side, a valley on the other side, and then in the valley in the middle, and then a hill on the other side. You see that in several places around here, and all the way down into Bowling Green. Well, that's basically what the hill of Elah, the valley of Elah is. When you think of where this battle was that took place between the Philistines and the Israelites, and where David met Goliath, it's right there in that valley, somewhere in there. Here's the brook where David got his stones that runs between these hills. Over here, it's thought that this is somewhere over in here is where the Israelites would have been located. And somewhere along this hill here, this rise here, is where the Philistines were. And they would meet down in the battle. So Goliath would come down here in the valley and challenge the Israelites. And so David then came across from over here, picked up a stone, and went and killed Goliath. So anyway, that gives you kind of a bird's eye view of the valley of Elah. Let's read the text here in 1 Samuel 17, verses 1 through 3. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah. And they camped between Socoh and Azekah and Ephes-dammim. Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and camped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array to encounter the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, while Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with the valley between them. So there's the valley of Elah. When you read that passage, think of this picture, and that would be what it's like. And think of it as you drive around Litchfield. There are a lot of places where you see valleys. It would be similar to it. So it can give you a picture of what it would have been like at that day. And it's just a nice flat valley between two low hills. And it's about halfway between Bethlehem, where David lives, and the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, where the Philistine cities were located. And Jonathan and Saul had been causing enough problems with the Philistines that they apparently decided it was time to do something about these pesky little Israelites, put an end to them. And so they came out, and that's where they ended up across this valley from them. Now, zooming in a little closer, we see the giant who dared defy God. Look in chapter 17. Let's read verses 3 through 10. 1 Samuel 17, verses 4 through 10. It says, Then a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines, named Goliath, from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was clothed with scale armor, which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. He also had bronze greaves on his legs, and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. His shield carrier also walked before him. He stood, going back to that valley, he stood and said to them, Why do you come out to draw up in battle array? Am I not the Philistine, and you servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will become your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall become our servants. Again, the Philistine said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man who we may fight together. So the idea is of Goliath is this giant of a man. Here in most versions of the Bible say that there's six cubits, which is roughly 18 inches, or could be in some cases 16 inches. So roughly anywhere from 8 feet 6 inches tall to 9 feet 6 inches tall. There are a couple of older texts, or at least one older Hebrew text, and the Septuagint say 4 cubits, which would make him only 6'6". So I think that's probably not the correct one. I think it's 9'6", or somewhere between 8 and 9 feet tall, somewhere in that range. He's huge. And that's the point, is he's huge. And so I tried to find some pictures to give us an idea of the contrast between what this giant Goliath would look like in comparison to this little boy David, who probably was about 5'2" or 5'3", because most grown men of that age, in that day and time, would have been about 5'6". And I'm 6'1", so think of somebody 6 inches taller than me, shorter than me. That's what they would have been. And David would. Yeah, I wish I didn't think of this. I should have brought a picture of me and my sisters. My sisters are all 5'2". And I don't think of them being short until I'm standing next to them, and I'm like, they're right here. Yeah. So imagine somebody who's here, looking down. And so I thought I'd give you some pictures to kind of give you a visual an idea what it would look like. This guy right here is a guy named David Madlow. David Madlow, or Wadlow, excuse me, Robert Wadlow. This picture was taken in 1940. He is 8 feet 11 inches tall. 8 feet 11 inches tall. So he's getting up there pretty close to about where Goliath would have been. 8 feet. And so you see, I don't know how tall the guy was that's standing next to him, but that gives you an idea of just how tall he was. Then I found a picture of basketball players. You think of basketball players, those are some of the tallest people you'll ever see in a general. All right, here's a picture of some of the tallest basketball players. They're 5'3". This is 5'3", which would have been about how tall David would have been. Then you've got 6 feet, so that's about how tall Saul probably was, since he was head and shoulders taller than everybody else. And then you go all the way up to 7. Well, imagine going up to 8, 9 feet tall. This guy's going to be huge. Found another picture. Anybody here ever watched The Princess Bride? Raise your hand. You can shake your head, raise your hand. Okay, all right. So we got some people who saw The Princess Bride. Andre the Giant, 7 feet 4 inches tall. Andy, whatever his name is, this guy here is 6 feet tall. This guy's 5'2". So this is David, and this guy's shorter than Goliath, probably. You look at the height difference, size difference. So the point is that Goliath is this huge, monstrously huge man who is a trained warrior. And David's just this little shepherd boy. And so this makes David's faith shine even more brightly in his bold belief in God. Well, let's zoom out a little bit and talk about some more things here in the text. Let's look at the cowardice in the camp in verse 11, chapter 17, verse 11. So here's this giant of a man coming out every day. Send out somebody to fight me. Come on, you can kill me. And he probably used some profanities and was cursing God and was a profane man. Verse 11, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So they were scared. They could not see beyond the fact this guy's huge bulk. He's huge. There's no way I can fight him. There's no way I can fight him. And they hid and they were scared instead of trusting in God. And so that's the cowardice in the camp. And that kind of sets the stage now for David to come along and demonstrate bold belief. Well, let's look first of all at David's arrival. So David shows up in the camp in verses 12 through 22. And this just tells you some of the story. Now, David was the son of the Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, whose name was Jesse, and he had 8 sons. And Jesse was old in the days of Saul, advanced in years among men. The 3 older sons of Jesse had gone after Saul to the battle, and the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and the second him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. Now the 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to attend his father's flock at Bethlehem. The Philistine came forward morning and evening for 40 days and took his stand. So for over a month, this insult was thrown in their face, and their fear just settled in deeper and deeper. Then in verse 17, then Jesse said to David his son, take now for your brothers an ephah of this roasted grain and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to your brothers. Bring also these 10 cuts of cheese to the commander of their thousands, and look into the welfare of your brothers, and bring back news of them. For Saul and all the men of Israel are in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. So David arose early in the morning and left the flock with the keeper and took the supplies and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the circle of the camp while the army was going out in battle array, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up in battle array, army against army. Then David left his baggage in the care of the baggage keeper and ran to the battle line and entered in order to greet his brother. So here comes David, this little kid, running around amongst all this army. And I think we don't understand that now. We're so used to these large, very well organized military that doesn't have stragglers. In days like that, and in many places even today, they would have a lot of stragglers, and they would have a lot of people hanging around the camp. They would have people because they didn't have professional cooks and all the supplies and MREs and things like that professional armies have today. So there would be large groups of people around the camp, including wives and kids. And so David's running around the camp. He's a little boy. He wants to see the fight. He wants to see what's going on. This is exciting to him. So he comes running along to see this. And so he gets there just in time to hear this giant of a man challenge, and in David's mind, not the Israelites, but God. Verse 23. Verse 23, as he was talking with him, behold, the champion, the Philistine from Gath, named Goliath, was coming up from the army of the Philistines, and he spoke these same words, and David heard them. When all the men of Israel saw the man, they fled from him and were greatly afraid. So David gets there, the guy comes out, he starts challenging, and they all run. And David's sitting there, or standing there, watching this, wondering, why is this happening? Verse 25, the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who is coming up? Surely he is coming up to defy Israel, and it will be that the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. Then David spoke to the men who were standing by him, saying, what will be done? And I want you to notice his attitude toward Goliath. Not will be done if. It's a statement of fact. What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God? So David's already upset at his own Israelite brothers and his family and the whole army, because they're standing there afraid of this man. Verse 27, the people answered him in accord with this word, saying, thus it will be done to the man who kills him. And then here's where we get to introduction. His brothers, you can't do this. You're too young. Shut up and go home and tend the sheep. He didn't want his brothers to succeed because they have been humiliated by their fear. Verse 28, now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger burned against David. And he said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? And so you're just a nothing nobody, you little punk. What are you doing? I know your insolence and the wickedness of your heart, for you have come down in order to see the battle. You just want to be a looky-loo, somebody watching. But David said, what have I done now? Was it not just a question? Then he turned away from him to another and said the same thing, and the people answered the same thing as before. And so David's serious about this. He's dismayed at the dismay among the Israelites. Their lack of trust, their lack of faith. And then in verses 31 through 37, we see his bold faith. When the words which David spoke were heard, they told them to Saul, and he sent for him. And I want you to notice what David says to Saul. Let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Then Saul said to David, you were not able, and again, here's another one saying, you can't do it. You're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, while he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep when a lion or bear came and took a lamb from the flock. I went out after him and attacked him and rescued it from his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine who doesn't scare me any more than a lion or a bear would. The Lord who the servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. Notice the attitude and heart of David. This guy's insulting the armies of God. I may be little, but I'm not afraid. I serve God. He puts his trust and his faith in God. He said, the Lord who delivered me from the mouth and the paw of this lion and the bear, that God will save me from that guy. I'm not worried about him. Bold bold belief. And then the next thing we see is just simple weapons. Saul, and we won't take the time to read this. Saul tries to get him to put on his military uniform and his armor and carry his sword, and it doesn't fit David. And so David decides, you know what, I don't want that. It's not going to work. He took them off. Verse 40 says, he took his stick in his hand and chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in the shepherd's bag, which he had even in his pouch. And his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. So he just took a simple weapon. He said, I don't need fancy stuff. I need stuff that I can use, and I'm used to working with. And then we see him, what I call disdain for the profane. He doesn't have any respect for this evil guy. None at all, because he's evil. And he's opposing God. Verse 41, then the Philistine came on and approached David with the shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy with a handsome appearance. The Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine also said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. And then notice David's response. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin. So you bring the mighty works of man and the weapons of warfare. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you, and I will give the dead body of the army of the Philistines this day, the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. So the whole world's going to know there's a God in Israel. And now he's going to look at his people. He's not talking just to Goliath. He's talking to the Israelites and to us. And that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. And then we see what happened, verse 49. David took his hand in his bag, took from a stone and slung it, and struck the Philistine on the forehead, and the stone sank into his forehead so that he fell on his face to the ground. And so that it ends in victory. Verses 15 through 58, you have victory and vindication. So David is vindicated. You have this complete destruction and death of Goliath, this giant who had been defying and insulting God and God's people. And David proved that God delivers. God delivers. They don't need to be thinking about human weapons for delivery, but God to give them the delivery. And so that's David, a better man, a bold believer. Well, let's wrap up with just a few takeaways. Some things for us to take from the text. First takeaway is, don't give in to spiritual bullies. The world is filled with spiritual bullies, people who tell you, you don't know what you're talking about, you don't understand the Bible, you don't know what I felt. They'll have all these kinds of reasons to tell you that you don't know what you're talking about. Don't listen to them. And they will try to shut you up and shut you down. Don't listen to them. Don't be argumentative and fighting with them, but don't let them stop you from believing what you believe. Look at verses 44 and 45 again. The Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. Now, people don't talk to us in that kind of language, but they talk in that kind of idea of, if you don't believe what I believe, then you need to just keep your mouth quiet. I told you, I preached once in a church in Orlando, not far from my house, where I knew that they were doing some things that they called it Self-Church Christ, and they were doing some things that they shouldn't have been doing, and I went there, and I talked about how the Scripture works, working through Scripture and through history of how churches constantly are doing things God doesn't want them to do. And I never once said, you are doing these things. But they knew what I was talking about, and they were infuriated and told me that you just go back over where you came from, don't come back here again. Okay. You want to hear the truth on this matter? And that explained why that we'd been getting a lot of people who were leaving this church because of that attitude, and I couldn't understand why they were leaving, why you didn't stay and fight. And I got there, and after one experience and exposure to it, I understand why they didn't stay and fight. Because it's just not nasty. Well, you don't give in to bullies. And the way they could have given in to the bullies was just to stay and be quiet and not stand up against it, or at least express their difference with it. So don't give in to bullies. The second thing is believe in your God. And I say specifically your God. Recognize that He is personal to you, and that your relationship with God is a personal relationship. He is the one who sent His Son, and His Son is the one who died for you, and He is your God, your Christ, your Messiah. He's not mine. He's not the Lilac Road Church of Christ. He's yours. And understand that relationship and believe Him in Him. Verse 46, this day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands. Not saying He's going to do it through somebody else. No. The Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the army this day, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. It's personal to David, and he's going to be personally involved in this. So He is your God. So believe in God as your God, not some remote being that belongs to somebody else, but as the God who saved you and lives with you if you will live with Him. Third thing, boldly declare your faith. Verse 47. Think about this. Boldly declare your faith. Verse 47. And that all this assembly may know. I don't know that David turned around and looked, but I'm sure he's making clear that his Israelite brethren behind him hear this. All this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord, and He will give you into our hands. Don't be afraid to say what you believe. One of the things that our culture tries to talk this morning about our enemies, and we don't really have enemies that are going to beat us up. Not really. I mean, there may be some cases, but not really. Not going to happen. But they will do everything they can to tell you, stop talking. Stop telling your faith. They will try to get you to stop declaring what you believe. Don't give in. Don't give in to that. Boldly declare your faith, and then act decisively. Verse 48. Then it happened when the Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David, that David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. So when it's time to act, act. Don't rub hands. Don't fret. Don't worry. Don't start listening to the advice of you can't do it. Do it. And if you're going to act, right now is a good time to act. As we ask and end with this question, are you a bold believer like David? You need to be baptized for the remission of your sins. If you're not a Christian, if you haven't done that, you're not a Christian. And if you're not a Christian, you're not in fellowship with Christ. He's not your God. And that's not the kind of thing that any preacher like Paul likes to say. But it must be said because we worry about souls and we want people to be saved. And if you're not a Christian, you need to become one. You need to believe that Jesus is the Christ, Son of the living God. Repent of your sins, confess His name, and be baptized in water so that your sins can be washed away by His blood. Not by the water, but by His blood. And then you can arise to walk in newness of life. But if you're going to do that, now's a great time to do it. Act boldly. Come while we stand and while we sing.